Assalamu alaikum and welcome to Asian Muslim Voices, the MuslimARC panel. We have a special guest with us today, Dr. Emad Rahim, and we are coming to you from all parts of the world. So I'm going to introduce our panelists very briefly, and then we can get started talking about our topics today. So our guests, I'm Namira Islam. I'm the Executive Director of MuslimARC right now. I'm a Bangladeshi American attorney. I'm living in Flint, Michigan, and I'm also a graphic designer. But I'm working in poverty law right now, and I've worked in prisoner rights litigation in the past, and I've also interned for the United Nations in war crimes before. We have Dr. Emad Rahim here. Dr. Rahim is an award-winning author, educator, and entrepreneur. He co-founded 2 startups, a consulting firm, and a nonprofit human service association in Central New York. Dr. Rahim is the appointed entrepreneur in residences for Oklahoma State University. He currently serves as a visiting scholar at Northwestern University. He previously served as the University Dean of Business at Colorado Technical University. Dr. Rahim lives in Chicago, loves coffee, considers himself to be a foodie, and is passionate with this thing called entrepreneurship. He co-authored the book Leading Transforming Managers into Effective Leaders, published by Common Grounds Publishing. Dr. Emad Rahim is a survivor of the Cambodian killing fields, and he has a short documentary on YouTube that's about his experiences surviving the concentration camp and coming to the United States, and it's called Against the Odds on YouTube as well. Sabina Kahibara is with us. She's a Pashtun American freelance writer and editor from California. Sabina regularly contributes to her blog Ibrahim's Tree, which she created after the loss of her infant son in 2011. And in 2013, Sabina created Muslim Montage as a platform for women to share their stories and inspire others. Lastly, we have Zara Nasser, who's the daughter of Pakistani immigrants. Zara began her involvement in racial justice and community organizing through an internship, where she began a new student organization to mobilize students and Detroit residents around immigration reform during the 2010 elections. After graduating with a Bachelor in Arts in University of Michigan, Zara worked in fundraising, and she wrote grants aimed at racial health disparities before taking her current community organizing job at Starfish. She left that position as the first organization at Starfish. Zara worked closely with PTO members, school administrators, and local legislators, and led over a dozen community conversations and hundreds of one-on-one meetings to galvanize parents and in-store residents around early childhood issues. So let's get started talking about Asian identities and sort of definitions. One of the first questions, Dr. Sylvia Chen Malik during Monday's panel had mentioned that you talk about, Asian Americans or Asian Muslims, but in Asia, people don't really identify as Asian. They identify as possibly a smaller group or some kind of other terms that think about themselves. So let's talk about what groups we identify with, and whether these terms are useful. What are some pros and cons to these terms? Why don't we start with Dr. Rahim?
Okay, I think that's definitely an important topic. One of the things that is important is the context of maturity, right? Because so many people use the word Asians when they are at a certain age group, I would say. Like when I was a teenager, I would always say I was Asian because I didn't really know my identity, right? I didn't really fit into a particular group because of my neighborhood, because of my background, because of my family structure. But as I grew up, I started using the word, Muslim, Cambodian American, right? Because I figured that my religion came first, then my ethnicity, and I started really learning about my ethnicity and learning about my history, my background, my culture, my religion, all these things. And as I evolved, I realized that my ethnicity is my stronger identity, I would say, especially in America, because people feel that they want to be, because certain groups will tend to gravitate towards you when you identify yourself under a certain ethnicity, right? Especially in academics, in social settings, in family structures. So I went from just being Asian, I think like a lot of Americans, right? To being Muslim Cambodian American, which is a long title, right? To being Cambodian Muslim, and then having American at the end of it, right? And then now it's more of, Islam is a religion. I am Muslim, but in the context of ethnicity and Asian, I am Cambodian American, or what we call Khmer American, right? And I see a lot of people going through this evolution. When I speak to younger people, they always say Asian. They could be Indian, they could be Pakistani, they could be Cambodian, Vietnamese. They always use the word Asian, right? When you speak to older people, when I use the word older people, right, we're not saying old, right? We're
Yeah.
saying people that have that have experienced life, right? That what you went off to college, you became cultured, you became experienced, you got married, your friends are more diverse, you step outside your comfort zone, you start trying to identify yourself based on what you know about yourself, right? And if you don't really know about yourself and your history, you're more likely to be more comfortable in saying the word Asian,
Right.
right? Versus saying that you are Cambodian, saying that you are Pakistani, saying that you're Vietnamese, and you feel like now you are required to support that, right? You are required to speak the language, right? Or you're required to wear certain clothing that represent your ethnicity. You're required to hang out with people that look like you. So I think much of this conversation has to do with maturity when we talk about being Asian and your identity within the continent, right? Because we're talking about a continent, not a country, not just one ethnicity. And even within a certain country, even Cambodia, there are tons of tribes, right? There are tons of ethnicity. And when you go to Cambodia, people will not always say they're Cambodian, right? And I think the same thing goes if you're in Pakistan, if you are in India, people will say they come from this city, right? They come from this tribe, they come from this particular religion, this ethnic group. So I think it's such a huge topic. It's very fascinating, but much of it has to do with maturity and experience when it ties back to Asian identity.
I think so too. Sabina?
I definitely agree with Dr. Rahim, and I would even say that it's a kind of an evolution. You evolve. Like when I was younger, my parents always told me I was Pashtun, but when we would go to the masjid, it was run by predominantly Urdu-speaking Pakistanis. So when I would say I'm Pakistani, it wasn't very easy for them to digest because I wasn't Urdu-speaking and I didn't look like them. But my family back in Pakistan were indigenous to that land, and so there's nothing else but to say that I'm Pakistani. They would be more comfortable with me saying I'm Afghan, but that wouldn't be correct either. So I went through this phase of realizing I didn't look necessarily like what people thought Pakistani would look. So I distanced myself from it for a while, and I just called myself Pashtun. And then the Afghan people, and I grew up in Fremont where there's a lot of Afghans, and they welcomed me with open arms. You're Pashtun, you're one of us. And ethnically, I guess we're the same. Even in my father's birth certificate, the ethnicity says Afghan. But I guess if Pakistan was, when it was created, we became Pakistani. So I went through this phase, okay, so I'm Pakistani American, and then I realized, well, more than Pakistani, I'm Pashtun, because when you come to my house, we speak Pashto. We have a very different culture than a lot of the Pakistanis do. So I'm Pashtun, Pakistani American, because I'm also American, because when I go back to Pakistan to visit my family, I'm nothing like them. And my Pashto apparently has an American accent, and I'm just too American for them. So I've just learned to, I've just evolved, and I've learned that there's a lot more to me than just one or two labels. And so that's what I've come to realize personally.
Right. I think we lost Zara because she's in Pakistan and her internet connection's a little bit rough. But we'll see. It's a really great, insight, Dr. Rahim, was, this idea that once you identify with a certain group, you might then you have more responsibilities almost, because it's this idea that, like, okay, well, you're, Bengali, do you speak Bangla? Do you know your culture? Can you read and write? And I think as Americans, we run into this issue where, obviously if somebody's born and raised here or has lived here for a very long time, it's harder. It's obviously harder. And I think it's the counter, it's this counter force, because at the end of the day, when you're going to school with groups that, there's predominantly a different ethnicity, maybe like white or, a different ethnicity, and then there's a smaller group of Asians, I think there is this idea of when you're younger of like, we're all Asian, let's all band together because we're all Asian. Because there's just less of you. So, it's like, okay, we're all, Desi, or we're all, even for me, like the school that I grew up in, it was in, one of the suburbs of Detroit, and, a lot of, it's very predominantly white, and so we had a lot of, either Asian of East Asian, South Asian, not as many Arab, but a few, and I think it was just this idea of we're all, Asian and we're not white, and so we band together a little bit more. But as I got older, it definitely became clearer to me that it is important to distinguish between, okay, yeah, I'm Desi, but what does that mean? I do understand Urdu, and I do understand Hindi, but to produce it, I can't produce it really. I do understand it, which is different than other Bengali Americans, but at the same time that it sort of provides this interesting dynamic with my Pakistani friends, because I can understand what they're saying when they're talking to their parents on the phone, or in general when they're referencing Bollywood or other things, like I can understand it. But as a Bengali, we do have a completely separate language. There's different dialects, there's different history, and it's not as simple to just say that we're all Asian or we're all Desi. There are differences there, and I think it can be detrimental to say that we're all unified, because that can do away with some of these tensions that exist, and it really can affect, we don't get certain things out in the open, and certain stereotypes that come up, we just end up not being able to talk about them at all. On that note, we can probably switch to talking a little bit more about stereotypes, things that we have heard about our own groups that we belong to, things that our groups, members of our groups can say about other groups. We can start, trying to delve into this a little bit more and go past that facade of unified Asian. Sabina, why don't we start with you for this one?
So, like I mentioned before, I'm Pashtun American. So Pashtuns in Pakistan are known as, they call them walnut brain, which means small brain. They're also, I know, and they also, what they do is, if you watch a lot of their movies in Pakistan, or their dramas, you'll see that the guard is usually a Pashtun. So he's got the gun, he's a big guy, he's lighter skinned, and he's loyal. But that's about as far as he goes in terms of, the glass ceiling. That's it for him. But although I will say that my mom watches PTV, which is Pakistan TV, and I've seen a big change in that. It's changed now, where Pashtuns are now not just these villagers or these barbarians that have no intellect. They're actually now seen as like humans, and as nuanced and as diverse as they are, thank God. And so there is a change, but there is still this general feeling of that Pashtuns are not as smart as the rest of the group, and they are also, while people love to say, oh, my grandmother was Pashtun, if your child, an Urdu-speaking person's child, comes to them and says, I want to marry someone who's Pashtun, that's just not done. They really just look down upon it. And I guess the same thing is for us as Pashtuns. If someone comes and says we want to marry somebody other than a Pashtun, that's also looked down upon. It's frowned upon, and people just discourage it. And like me, I married, not only did I marry outside of my ethnicity, I married a convert, and so that put me in another group. And I guess I guess I'm seen as now somewhat of a rebel because of that, but I mean, I hope in a good way, in a way that teaches people that Islam, the real essence of Islam is to look at the soul and not to see the exterior at all. So I hope that if I did make a change, it's a good change, and inshallah, my children see that as well.
Dr. Rahim?
No, I went through a period of confusion and self-hatred. Right. When I grew up in Brooklyn, and then later on I moved to upstate New York, there was a lot of hatred towards Asians, especially the refugee community. Right. And I did not want to feel different. I did not want to stick out. And not to say I was fortunate, but because of how I look, I think I fell into a lot of categories. Right? I think a lot of people thought I was Puerto Rican. They thought I was mixed with some type of Asian ethnicity with black. Right? And I grew up in a predominantly black neighborhood, a community that is mixed with Haitians and Puerto Ricans and Dominicans. So I think with my brown skin, with my Brooklyn accent, I kind of fit right in. But I did not realize how bad it was until I became a teenager and I was a part of these conversations with Italians, with Puerto Ricans, with African Americans, and they would, speak poorly about the Vietnamese. They would speak poorly about the Laos community, about the Chinese community, right? And they would say it to me like I'm a part of them, right? Not this. They would talk to me like I am black, right? They would talk to me like I'm not Italian. I don't look Italian, but they would use the word goop and chink right in front of me,
Wow.
right? Without hesitation, because all of a sudden I was a part of this conversation, and I would be a part of these conversations that other Asians were not a part of, right? So I start realizing, wow, because I'm a part of this conversation, I'm not debating in this dialogue. I'm not really participating in this dialogue. I'm not advocating. I just wanted to feel normal. So I would smile, right? I would nod my head. I would be a part of this conversation, and I would say negative things towards Asian people, right? Because I did not want to feel different. I did not want to be the outsider. But then when I started noticing people like my mother get discriminated, my siblings, my cousins, that's when I realized this is awful, this is bad, right? I can't be a part of this. I have to speak out, right? And I think many people fall in that category that we, like I think both of you had mentioned, being part of an Asian community. I was the person that did not want to be a part of the Asian community because the Vietnamese, which is a really large population in Brooklyn, which is a large population upstate New York, they did not want me, right? I was not a part of that community. We have a history, right? Cambodia and Vietnam have a negative history, right? The Thai people did not want me. We have a negative history. We have a very bad history, right? Burma, all these countries around Cambodia, there's a really bad history. And I was not aware of that stuff. I just knew that I was not allowed to hang out with them. They did not want to hang out with me. So I hung out with the black kids. I hung out with the Puerto Rican kids, right? So I think that's another layer of this conversation when we talk about Asian identity and stereotypes. And also when I grew up, the positive stereotypes, when we say, the positive with air quotes of Asians, right? We're what? We're smart, right? We are amazing in math, right? We are obedient, right? We listen. We're hard workers, right? We come from these horrific backgrounds that people should feel sorry for us and look out for us. I was exact opposite, right? I did awful in school. I was dyslexic. When we started learning algebra and you put numbers with words, that was like a third, that was a foreign language. I was going crazy. And no one wanted to help me because I was this Asian kid that should have gotten it, right? Like, why are you acting up? Why are you getting the fights? Why are you part of gangs? Why are you getting poor grades? You're Asian, which really made me more angry towards the system, right? And then I didn't, and even if I could get good grades, I didn't want to get good grades because I didn't want to fit into that category. Because then all of a sudden I am those people, right? There's no way I could be this person because my grades are good. I'm acting normal. I'm acting the stereotypical, Asian-like type of person. And even now in academia, now that I'm teaching in academics, people think that my life was great, right? That it was easy for me. That of course you have a doctorate. Of course you're a professor. You're Asian. This is what you're supposed to do. Right? It must have been so easy for you. And I have had these conversations even in committees, and to be honest, in faculty committee, when they are hiring people and they look at people's names, like with the word Lee in the last name, right? If you have a name that looks very Pakistani, very Islamic, they would discriminate. They would say we have enough Asians at this university, right? We have enough Indians, right? And I'm in the room with them, right? Because in their eyes, I'm a part of that community, and because of my background, I can't stay silent anymore, right? but we definitely have to fight the system. We can't go along with it, right? But we also can't we can't we can't we can't act on self-hatred, right? We can't technically embrace it. We can't we cannot embrace the stereotypes, but we can't hate our ethnicity and our population because of these stereotypes. We have to speak out, right? We have to engage in that dialogue, in that conversation, and that's the important piece.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely, I completely agree with that. And I think that definitely reminds me of certain things that I've heard about, Bengalis and these stereotypes growing up. I know the masjid that I went to was predominantly Pakistani. And my parents, the East Pakistan, West Pakistan, that civil war was during their lifetime. They lived through that. They were young, but they lived through it. And so I know that it was one of those things. I remember coming home one day and mentioning it to my parents that, oh, did you know that there was this thing that Bengalis and Pakistanis don't get along possibly, and that was the first I'd heard of it, because we weren't raised knowing that there had been this issue or that there was something going on, there was that history there, but later we heard about that. So there have been stereotypes from that where people at the masjid, they just assume that you're brown skin, and therefore you're Pakistani, so they speak to you in Urdu, and then you can't respond in Urdu, and they sort of give you these looks, and you're considered, if they realize that you're not Pakistani, even if they don't, then you're considered, something's wrong with you, that you don't speak Urdu and you can't respond back in Urdu. So I don't, part of it, making sure that we understand Urdu, I think part of that might have been intentional, that we realized there was some value to that growing up in a community that was so much, so many Urdu speaking people in it. I think growing older, I've noticed more stereotypes, just little comments. My sister tells the story about somebody, it was a Pakistani girl at her university, so she was in college at that point, and somebody mentioned to her, well, you're Bengali, like, all Bengalis hate themselves, right? And my sister was very taken aback, like, what do you mean that all Bengalis hate themselves? Other stereotypes that, out of all the Desis, out of all the South Asians, that, Bengalis are the most Hindu of the bunch, that we are less Muslim than the rest of the other and the other South Asians. And I think, from talking to my Indian friends, that they get this as well, that, well, you can't be as Muslim, you're Indian, when it's completely, the demographics and the history shows that this is unfounded, but we do get these stereotypes that, well, Bengalis, they're the more Hindu of the bunch. And for me, like, I started wearing hijab about 6 years ago. So before that, I remember I had an Egyptian roommate who had friends who asked, like, is your roommate Hindu? And it was, I guess that's part of it, where, you wear hijab and it's a different signal, it's a different, so it's, sorry, I was having some trouble logging back down. But it can be very problematic to where we have these situations, stereotypes that just, they come out, and I think they can catch you by surprise, and you don't know what to say in response. You don't know what to just say in that moment to be like, that's really problematic. And I think, at MuslimARC, that's one of the things that we're trying to talk about is, how do we approach this? What can we say? What can we really do to get at the root of these kind of stereotypes? And it comes up in marriage all the time that, and like Sabina mentioned, like, we have this too, where it's a back and forth situation. We'll do it to outsiders. So a Bengali girl wants to marry a non-Bengali guy, and it's very problematic. And then, we also get that from other groups. That, she's Bengali. I've heard stories about people, even Pakistani Indian, even both Urdu speakers, and parents still are preventing that marriage. And so we get that, Bengali is even a different language completely, so it doesn't matter as much. But then obviously Bengalis will do that to outsiders, even within Bangladesh. There's different tribal kind of, not tribal necessarily, but different groups that, they have stereotypes about each other, and some of them are sort of silly stereotypes, like certain, this one group, they like to take food home after an event, that they always take carry out with them, and these like silly kind of stereotypes, or another group has bad temper, or another group is stingy, or based on region in Bangladesh. But we have that as well. So I think it can get very problematic. And obviously, when it comes to non-Desi, I mean, at that point, stereotypes, and this is why this term Asian is so problematic in some senses. I think that this one group, because we have, I've heard Bengalis use slurs for East Asians, and it's terrible. I mean, it's really East Asians. Obviously, there's the skin tone conversation, which leads to very racial kind of racist kind of statements about people who have darker skin, so that Black Americans and African Americans. Even I know like Pakistanis, like you'll hear the term like Gora or Gori for white, and these things that just refer to people automatically. It's very, I don't know if there's this sense of doing it out of defense, or it's just how it's always been done, that, well, we rely on groups. We rely on these group stereotypes to instantly say something about a member of that group. I'm not sure if that's what it is. So, but yeah, let's talk a little bit about colorism, because we had this discussion the very first week of May. It was Not Fair and Lovely, the hashtag conversation. We had this discussion about colorism and the use of skin lightening creams. And the Fair and Lovely cream is based out of India. It's an Indian cream. It's marketed all over the world. I was wondering what experiences you both had regarding skin lightening or assessment of value based on skin tone. Dr. Rahim, why don't we start with you?
Yeah, I've never had experience with skin lightening cream or know people that have used it. But in the context of of people with darker skin versus lighter skin, I think that's a conversation that's been happening for centuries. And it's also a conversation that divides us, that prevents us from working with each other, that creates this class system of one group is better than other based on how light their skin is. In my kids are biracial, right? So they are Cambodian and African American, and I've heard the word good hair a lot, right? I mean, I have no hair, so I don't have a problem with that. But that irritates my wife like crazy, and I didn't really understand why, right? Until until I got to have this conversation with her on why that's a bad thing. To hear it from another black mother that my daughter has good hair, which means that her daughter, right, has bad hair, right? Or my daughter is light-skinned, which means she is beautiful, right? And maybe someone that is dark is not as beautiful. So it requires me to have this conversation with my children and make sure that they're aware of how people view them, of how they may feel different, even amongst people that are black, amongst people that are Cambodian, that they should be aware of this and be open to have a conversation. And it's a tough conversation to have with children because they are at the stage where they want to play with everybody, where everyone looks friendly, where everyone could be a classmate that you can invite home. They don't understand that while you may want to invite them, they may not be able to invite you, and that's a conversation that we need to have. But in a context of marriage, right, I see it happening a lot now. Because of where I grew up, I dated many, I would say the majority of the girls that I dated back in high school were black or Puerto Rican, right? So I never had this problem. I never understood the difference between light skin and darker skin until I got married. I did not choose skin color when I married my wife. I married her because I thought she was an amazing person. I thought that she was a wonderful person. But after marrying her, then I could start hearing those those undertones within conversation that, oh, your wife is black. I see now. Okay, so why did you marry her? Like there must have been a bad thing, right? So why exactly did you marry her? I mean, did you did you impregnate her? Is that the reason why? These type of conversations happening not only in the Cambodian community, but even in the larger Muslim community, right? You're a doctor, you teach at these universities. So why did you marry an African American? Like it's a bad thing. Like there was some type of reason outside of love, outside of interest, outside of common good and a strong relationship that there have to be something that's larger than that. So me and my wife, we just been having that conversation over and over again. And then also within the black community, that often my wife have to defend why she married me, right? Because when she said that she married, and let me say that she used the word Asian a lot because people don't know where Cambodia is, right? She one time she was at this dialogue session. She mentioned to them that her husband was Cambodian. They said, "Oh, Cameroon. He's Cameroon. Where in Africa is that?" Right? So it's funny like that. But she even, if before they see me, before they get to know me, if she said she's married to someone who's Asian or Cambodian, they also have certain stereotypes, right? Oh, your husband is this. Oh, what is it like? Or that idea of why would you marry outside your race? You are ruining the black culture. You are destroying the black history, and all these conversations. But often when they see me, they think that I am biracial. But prior to seeing me, based on being Cambodian, they have this stereotype in mind. Also, several years ago, a good friend of mine who's Italian and his wife is Dominican, she had told me something that really blew my mind, that her parents told her if she was going to marry an American, make sure that his skin is lighter than hers, right? Their way of thinking, that in order to purify, their ethnicity, their legacy, to improve their lineage, right, you should marry someone lighter. So before getting to know her husband, they were extremely excited and proud to say that she married an Italian American. He could be the worst person in the world, but they were excited that there's an opportunity for their kids to be lighter, for their kids to not look, like a dark Dominican, I would say. And that conversation is happening a lot. And I actually have heard it recently where a Somalian kid told me that's Muslim, where his parents are telling him, you could bring any girl to the house, just make sure she's not black, right? Wow. And so even amongst what we say, that's Africa, right? That is Africa, that is black, that's that's a continent that all African Americans, that all black people should unite around. There are stereotypes and racism happening between African Americans and what we consider Africans, right? So it's all over. But the amazing thing, and I don't want to overpower this conversation, but I think the next generation is doing an amazing job. I think the new generation, even though the people say really negative things about the millennials, about these hipsters, right? They're very tolerant. They could care less, to be honest. And I have been in tons of dialogue circles. I have been in large forums. I've spoke, in front of thousands, and they could care less, right? They are looking for things that interest them, and that unites them, right? You love hip hop, let's go to the concert together. Or you love Bali food, let's get something to eat, right? Mm-hmm. If there is a division between these groups, it's often because their parents got involved, right? Because money got involved, so it's more of a class system, right? It's more that, oh, these are the have-nots and these are the haves. So I think in regards to racism and stereotypes, it's evolving and changing for the greater good, but there's definitely, it's not gone, right? It's just different now.
Yeah, and I think we've seen that in general with part of the reason that people start coming together as as Muslims willing to talk about this. It's because we are seeing youth who are very, the racist terminology, the racist mentality, like these things, we do see them amongst our, online and obviously online comments, Twitter. You see a lot of the worst of the worst, but you do see it, and I think that's one reason that we had decided, okay, we really need to talk about this as Muslims, and really our concept behind it too is that, as Muslims, we're not trying to reform racial thinking. We're trying to revive what was once there, which is this discussion about, skin color and colorism, and these things are just completely haram. At the end of the day, like, to judge someone based on a skin tone that they were born with, that Allah blessed them with, to use that as some kind of, our metric of quality of what that person is as a person, as a Muslim, as what their character is just completely haram, and we need to make sure that that's really stressed. And I think with colorism, we see this a lot, where parents are trying to change the skin tone of their children. There were many tweets about not going outside as children because, your skin tone is going to get darker, to use the Fair and Lovely cream in order to get married. If you have darker skin, that's one reason people, it's acceptable somehow for parents, and oftentimes it's the mothers who will say things like, well, no, she's too dark, not for my son. These kind of comments, it's definitely widespread, and, it's this matter right now of how do we move forward, how do we prevent this. And I think part of it is that we are starting to, I know I've done it in my own life, when somebody will make some comment about, she's so pretty for those type of comments, just call them out, gently, and just say, like, can we talk about this a little bit? Like, why are we saying this? Why are we saying for a whatever, or making some kind of linkage in your speech that, having dark skin means that you are somehow less beautiful, or that it's, a thing that you're commenting on somebody being beautiful even if they have dark skin. Like, these things are just not, you can't do this. I know one thing that I grew up with was, my skin tone in Bangla, there's different levels of skin tone. So you've got Forsha, which means very white. You've got Kalo, which literally the word means black, like the color black. And then you've got some middle words, which like Shamla and Moila. And like Moila, for me, the word itself comes from the word for soil or dirt, so it's the color of dirt. But because of that, for me, growing up, I obviously, and this is like a cultural thing going on, where as an American, for me, that word, we use it often to refer to as dirty. So it's something that is dirty, like a cloth that is dirty. It's this idea of like moila, that you need to wash this, it's dirty. I think when you think about it being in a different context, though, you think about soil. Soil is very valuable, and as somebody who comes from a background where soil is used for planting or for growing land, or growing crops, or using that land, it obviously has a different context to it. But it's, these discussions of colorism, it goes back into this idea that, if you're lighter skin, you have more privileges in society, which to some extent is sadly very true, as we are seeing with, especially in the United States, we can see that. And if you're darker skin, you lose privileges and you have more problems. And, that can be something that is to some extent true, but that doesn't mean that we have to facilitate it and that we make sure that it stays that way. It's something that we should be actively working against. Sabina, do you want to talk a little bit about colorism, your own experience?
I mean, I have like lots of experiences with that, because before marriage, I mean, I never had that problem because I am considered lighter skin, but my sister's a little darker skin than me. I mean, she didn't have problems, but we have other people that are Pakistani who we know as friends. They were told to stay out of the sun right before they got married and to use Fair and Lovely. And a lot of times the darker friends were rejected. Their rishtas or their proposals were rejected because they were darker. And so I've seen it firsthand through my friends. And then when I was marrying my husband, who's a convert, I literally had this woman come to me and say, show me a picture of him. And my husband is half white and half Fijian. But he's a darker skin than me. So when I showed her a picture of him, she said, remove him from me. I thought if you married a convert, I'd rather see you marry a white man. Like, she literally said that to me, and I was hurt by that because Brother Rahim said that I when I married him, that was like the farthest thing from my mind as from my mind was a
Special
colorism.
guest now.
So it was the farthest thing from my mind. I mean, I didn't care about the external at all. It was that I had a connection with him, and that I felt that he would be a great father to my children. And so I married him, and then my child, my son, he is darker skinned than me. And so I've been to gatherings where people say, oh, he didn't get your light skin. And it hurts me because he's my son, and that he has to hear this as if his dark skin is a negative thing. And so I've learned to, he's too young to have a conversation. He's only 2. But I have learned to remove myself from these situations where I feel like there's negative people. If there's people I can talk to, like you said, pull them aside and let them know that this is not cool. Otherwise, I just learn to not be around those people until I can talk to my son and explain to him what he's going to be faced with, unfortunately, in certain parts of my culture, and and how to deal with it, and to learn to love himself, no matter what color he is. And so all these conversations are things I'm already anticipating. He's only 2, but I because of the initial reaction I saw when he was born, when they looked at him and said, "Oh, he's a boy, but he's not your color." It's just like, okay, yeah. I'm just glad that, because before him, it's ironic that people said that to me, because I had a son who passed away. So it's just like, I have a son that passed away, and then I have this son, and he means the world to me. Every child means the world to their parent, but he's extra special to me, and you still have these feelings. So I'm learning to navigate my own life around these conversations, and then inshallah, anticipating these conversations with my children and my family as we grow older. So it's just something that.
And it's very problematic if you think about it from a structural, societal level, because, like you said, you remove yourself from the situation eventually because it's so hurtful. It's so hurtful emotionally, and mentally it's exhausting and tiring, and psychologically it's not good. And so just, the solution is to remove yourself, and something like this is happening at the masjid or in your MSA or in some kind of conference or somewhere you're attending. Your solution is to remove yourself from Muslim events or gatherings. And that ultimately, the small thing that people can say, like, oh, what's the big deal about it? But it's not. It is a big deal. It does lead to these very widespread social ramifications of it, and how to go about fixing it. I mean, when somebody gets hurt by something, the reaction is to leave it. You don't just keep coming back for more. And we have, I've talked to people who, there's bullying situations happening in schools, even in Islamic schools, and masjids, and after Jummah prayer on Friday, these comments and this experiences, they're really negatively destroying fabrics of communities. And I think the United States, especially, when we're talking about wider societal, supremacist issues against Muslims, the stereotypes that Muslims face. It doesn't, supremacists and, people who are Islamophobes, like, they don't care what color you are as a Muslim. You're a Muslim, like, they're going to treat you the same way. You're going to get treated, as a Muslim first, not as somebody who's lighter skinned, whatever, or darker skinned, whatever, you're a Muslim. And, there are different experiences people have there, but at the same time, when our communities are so fractured internally, to then try to fight back against that, how are we supposed to do that? We can't. And, these things are just we need to address them, and, these small comments about skin color, like, they're very important to talk about. Dr. Rahim, do you have anything else to add to that part of it? I see you have your daughter with you now, who's very...
Yes, she woke up, so...
You can join us.
No, I think you made some great points. And, there's also a resentment, I guess, towards for African Americans that may be considered not authentic Muslims, right? Because of the history of the Nation of Islam, because of the work theme movement, made a lot of Muslims that are not African American often think that everybody that's black converted into Islam, versus not realizing that this person could be 3rd or 4th generation Muslim. And while while 9/11 was a very negative thing, right? Um, that many African Americans feel that now those that are Arabs, those that are Pakistanis, those that are Asian Muslims can feel the racism that they have experienced all throughout, American history. So I've also had that conversation where, you know, where where Asian or Middle Eastern Muslim groups or having these conversations with African Americans, and they're saying, well, we have been experiencing this all our life. And we've been trying to invite you in these conversations. We've been trying to get you engaged and get you involved in activism and speaking out in the support of African Americans, of Black Muslims, but you did not want to be a part of that, right? You felt that you couldn't relate. You felt that this had nothing to do with you. And then after 9/11, you start noticing that a lot of Middle Eastern Muslims, a lot of Asian Muslims are reaching out to the African American population saying, please help us, please engage in this conversation, please be a part of this activism, please help us protest, please bring us awareness. And they're saying, where were you?
Yeah.
Where were you when we were experiencing this racism? We have been experiencing this racism all throughout our life. We have been experiencing this racism even in our masjids when people refuse to stand next to us when we are praying, when we are not invited to weddings, when we are not invited to certain gatherings. We can't marry your daughters or we can't marry your husbands because of our skin tone. So I think there's still a level of resentment, but it's creating this dialogue that may have not taken place prior to 9/11.
This is a good point. And I think one thing that made me realize was, sometimes with our parents as Americans, the parents tend to sort of revolve in societal. Their circles are with people from their ethnicity. So they tend to surround themselves with people who are, their friends and their people they hang out with on the weekends are their own ethnicity. For us as their children, when we go out in broader society, we don't have that support network, and I think it's important for us to realize that when we go out in these other circles, Muslims that we are seeing are of different ethnicities and different groups. And for me as a lawyer, I know during law school it was I faced certain small microaggressions from classmates and professors and things like that, bosses even, but when it came to, I was working in prisoner rights litigation, so I'd go to prison and we'd be meeting with a client or a witness for a trial, and I'd be getting salams in prison from, inmates there. And, it's something where you realize, like, this is my, the wider fabric of society, like, this is what that is. Like, I'm not in some dawah over the weekend, some event where dinner party or something. There are Muslims in the prison who are saying salams to me. And as a lawyer right now who's working for low-income people who are technically, poverty level, it's a lot of I'll get salams at work, and I'm the only Muslim at the workplace, but I'll get salams at work from clients. And at that point you sort of realize, like, okay, this we need to work on this a little bit more and realize that, like, just the things that can fly in our parents' circles do not fly for us. Like, they don't work, and we need to look at it a different way.
But what is sad is I've noticed that a lot of the colorism is perpetuated, and younger people do make these comments and do prefer the lighter skin, and I don't know if it's fair to blame the elders. It's just that they really believe that the lighter skin is better. I've seen magazine articles about they see women talking about, and young women who write these articles about how to have the vibrant skin, and then and the comments that were made to me about my son were by women in their 30s, and it's just and these women are I don't know how educated they are, but they are they're in the American society. They're obviously part of the part of the same type of society that I grew up in. So I don't know why it's perpetuated, and I think that what needs to happen is it's nice to say, oh, you know, I think some people think, oh, it will just go away. If people just see a mixture of people, they see biracial couples, it'll just go away. But I honestly think a conversation needs to happen. I think people need to start talking about it, and people need to, it needs to be addressed at the masjid. It needs to be talked about at the dinner table, and I mean, and not just by people like me who have biracial children, but by all people. Just because it's I don't know what the solution is. I mean, but what I think it is maybe talking about it and talking about how it isn't Islamic and it's never been Islamic, and this is more of a cultural thing that, you know, that is destroying Islam, or what people think of Islam. So
yeah. Yeah, and I think you know, we do see with like people our age or like, you know, the youth, you know, this idea that if you do pick up some of these things and then you perpetuate it, some of the things that are affecting young people in this country, especially, you know, the idea of like beauty norms, and I see this with young women a lot, is that the idea of beauty norms is the white standard of beauty. And I think that's another place that this can come from, where because there's a white standard of beauty, all the ads that are aimed toward women, you know, generally speaking, it's very white models and white body types, and you know, which not to say that there's a specific, you know, there's obviously differences amongst people who consider themselves white, but in general, there's a very specific image that is put out in the media, and that's, you know, negatively affects all women. It's not just Muslim women. It's not just women of color who are Muslim. It affects all women very negatively. But because of this, we do see these efforts to like, well, you know, I want to have that look, and I want to have this look possibly that is a certain way. And I actually mentioned this to somebody I was talking to, I think a couple of days ago, that I read an article where it was talking about how the first camera was geared using a white woman's body. So when the camera is focusing on you, it actually is like calibrating from a white person's standpoint, that that's the skin tone that it can pick up a certain way, and have a person look a certain way on camera, on film, is based off a white woman. So I think for some young women, you do see that where it can be this intersection of, you know, gender issues with beauty ideals and beauty norms, that you also want to have your skin lighter because of that. You want to look more white, you know, more like a model, more like Hollywood because of that. And I think that can somehow, you know, add to it in the United States especially, and in general here where, you know, certain skin tones are criminalized to a different extent. It can be, you know, an internalized situation where you don't want to be part of that group, and you know, you don't want to have to suffer the same things as somebody from part of that group. So I think some of that also can pop into these issues, you know, with skin tone and younger people also buying into the same things that we're seeing and making it worse in some ways. Because it's younger and they have different reasoning for it as well than the parents do. The parents, you know, they may have something, and some people, I'm sure, their parents don't say anything, and they still pick it up somehow through their family or friends, or their friends at school. So we have about 5 minutes left, which I don't think is enough time to really get into issues of colonialism or politics in Asian backgrounds. So we can, any closing thoughts, you can do that and wrap up for the afternoon. It's been a really great discussion so far.
Well, I would like to thank you and the organization for putting on these different events. And, you know, this is an example of what makes, I think, not just your generation, but, you know, the generation after you, of a feeling of optimism, because this would not happen, I would say, you know, in my generation or the generation before me, right? It definitely wouldn't have happened with the baby boomers. You know, Generation X was too busy thinking about hip hop and AIDS. So I think the millennials are doing a great job in really creating events that bring people together, telling their story. I think stories are very powerful. When people hear stories, they gravitate towards those images, the language, the context, the history, more than the ethnicity, right? Because when we look at people, we put them in a box, right? We start stereotyping them based on what we think they should be because of how they look. But when we only hear about their stories, right, before we actually see them, about the stories, we start connecting with them. We say, okay, this person grew up in New York. Well, I grew up in New York. Or this person came as a refugee. Well, my family came as a refugee. So instead of stereotyping right away, we start connecting right away. So I think when we create these type of forums and these programs and these events that allow normal people to share stories and engage in a conversation that is outside of what's considered pop culture, it just makes our community stronger. It brings us together. It creates awareness around issues. It creates passion in people to fight for the greater good and to increase the quality of life for everyone. So thank you very much, and those are my closing remarks.
Well, that's wonderful to hear. Sabina, any closing remarks?
Well, I'd like to say that I'm honored to be part of such a group, and that I echo what the Dr. Emad Rahim said. I would also like to say that I'm really happy you guys touch upon colorism and racism, not just between the blacks and the whites in America, just within the Islamic community, the nuanced racism that goes on. I'm really happy to see these conversations, and I hope to be a part of many more of them. And I'm glad that this is happening, so that when my children, inshallah, grow up, they have something probably even better than we have right now, inshallah. So.
Yeah. Inshallah, that is the hope, that things will improve with every group that comes in, and we at least can start identifying the problems that exist, so that way we can start thinking about solutions. Because if we don't do that, if we don't even look at what is happening, what's happening on the ground, we need some kind of assessment of that in order to come up with solutions and some tactics to try to stem it off. So. But Jazakallah khair to you both for being here. It was a really great discussion. I'm glad we got to have it today. Inshallah, there will be many more. We're trying to think of some different formats to make sure that we have different perspectives, especially global perspectives, coming up in the upcoming years, inshallah, and that we get different perspectives, because obviously the U.S. context is it benefits us to speak from a U.S. context, but it can also, we don't want to export our different situations here. We don't want to export that onto other countries and other situations, and try to discuss things from a U.S. perspective in other places. So we're trying to make sure to do that a little bit more. We have next week on Wednesday, we have our final hashtag conversation for Asian Muslim Voices. We have Silk Route History, which will be on Wednesday at 2 p.m. Eastern Standard Time on Twitter, and so that we'll be trying to connect some of these Persian and Iranian history to South Asia and over to Malaysia, Indonesia, and just making sure that we sort of contextualize the history that is from this region and the Muslim history that is there, and sort of look at the different things that the different things we have in common, and contextualize all of our relationships. So, Jazakallah khair again to you both, and we hope to continue these conversations later.
Thank you.
Thank you. Assalamu alaikum.
Assalamu alaikum.